Hello, this is Arkan Games, and welcome to Once Upon a Galaxy Treasure Meta Snapshot for version 2.068723. I'll be going over the treasure meta archetype, why it's actually so strong in the current game and current version, as well as some general game philosophy, custom deck snapshots, as well as the main cards and why you should actually pick some of these cards and not others in the overall game flow, right? I think one of the main reasons why I decided to create this video is that, well, Once Upon a Galaxy is a relatively new game, and this meta archetype actually pushes itself way above the rest of the other archetypes when it comes to consistency and value generation. So I wanted to actually give my own 2 cents on it. For myself, I'm not really too much of a pro, just legendary 2.5k MMR on the side. But I think one thing that actually interests me about the game is that, well, the pool of cards is relatively small, so there is some level of consistency when it comes to getting the picks you want. And because of that, you really want to. It actually allows me to actually be able to think about my plays, about my pick tree, and why I actually make certain decisions as compared to others, right? So I think in terms of the general game flow, the first thing you have to realize is that it may not be apparent, especially if you've only been playing a few games at the very start. But at the end of the day, you're really trying to be the last one standing in this battle royale. And in order to get to that point, you actually have a very limited amount of actions within each round, right? So think about it this way. On average, if you don't hit any triggers or any special conditions, you would actually have only two choices you make per round, you know, and you would be thinking to yourself, how can I make the most impactful two decisions per each round as I go on, right? Because at the end of the day, usually games end around turn 8 to turn 10 if it's um a very early tempo game. And if it's a very late scale game, it can be up to even 14 plus. So on average, this means that you would be making around 16 to as much as 28 or even more choices that will give you the strongest possible board state to be able to win. Of course, in truth or in actual practice, you will actually have a lot more um, rounds when it comes to being played out because of the presence of silver, golds, treasures, as well as bonus shops, so on and so forth within the lineup. But at the end of the day, when it comes to thinking about it, you want to think how much value does that card actually give to my total board? And of course, you wouldn't be able to measure that sometimes when it comes to, for example, golding your cards because of the treasures that you would have to choose. But it's a sort of estimation. How much value can you try to get out of it? Right. So again, some of these notable exceptions. I think on the most part, if something gives you more shops, it's usually a lot stronger when it comes to the our value proposition that it can give you. The main reason why is because you are essentially having a +1 reroll, right? You're having a +1 reroll with a zero cost in terms of action, because when you silver a card, you reroll your shop, but you don't consume your overall turn in that sense, right? And when you get a silver, of course, you actually get the additional stats, which is also another bonus, right? When it comes to cards like or when it comes to actually cards with bonus effects, like for example later on you'll see Jasmine Dragon, where getting a treasure gives you a +1 shop, right? If you're able to generate that you're able to trigger that effect consistently, instead of 2 turns per round, you're actually having 3 turns per round, right? And that gives you another shot of having a silver, a gold, and additional treasure that will actually give you more power in terms of your overall board, right? So that's why these cards usually are much more valuable in the sense as compared to the other cards that you may see. Of course, to some limited, of course, in terms of comparing it to the overall tempo that certain cards that are able to actually give you, right? So when it comes to why treasures are good, I think the first thing that you would think of is Worm Scale Tinkerer, right? Worm Scale Tinkerer plus Fairy Dust. I'll be going over why there's the crazy combo later on when I go in depth about the card itself. But there are four main reasons why treasures are so good. Firstly, they have good carryover. Whenever you get a treasure, as compared to having a card that maybe a common card that you would replace down the line with a rare or epic, treasures carry over throughout the game. So whatever stats buff that you get from your twin shot don't become obsolete as you go later into the game, right? Secondly is the innate value that comes with a lot of treasures. Usually treasures, on the most part, help to boost up your board. So that's why there's a lot of value in that, because on an overall board level, rather than have a card that individually scales, you're actually able to have a treasure that boosts your whole board. So in terms of tempo gain, you're able to actually fight a lot harder. Thirdly is the exponential scaling that comes with certain treasures. For example, treasures that give you more treasures, or treasures that actually give you more stats if certain conditions are met. So that's why treasures by themselves, they can actually scale separately from your cards, and with that carryover and that value, you're able to actually be able to switch up your board or pivot your board towards a more legendary or super rare lineup without hurting your overall tempo, right? And then lastly, of course, it's the addition of candy. You have candy treasures in the pool. So having your candy, if your treasure is candified, in a sense, it's a treasure candy, whatever boost that you have to candy will actually boost all candy treasures by the amount of stats. So let's say if you have a candy treasure that gives you +1/+1. If you have 8 candy, it becomes a +8/+8. So if you have multiple treasure candies, so you get every one increase in the trigger of your candy will actually exponentially scale all the candy treasures together, which also again sort of boost up your overall board without the reliance on whatever that your board cards have. Yep. So why is it in the case that treasures, even if treasures are so strong, why is it that they usually people actually sometimes pivot from treasures to animals, to mages, to pirates? Well, there are three main reasons. Firstly, as in most auto battlers, you're dependent on few core pieces, right? If you're not, a large part of the treasure archetype is actually fueled by core dragon cards and a select few others, in order to be able to guarantee you have a treasure every turn or more, right? But if those dragons don't show up, then you have no choice but to actually pivot to something else, right? The second thing is that when it comes to treasure scaling, you also need to start to get your treasures early, right? Because most treasure engines do not give very strong treasures out of the gate, right? And secondly, of course, is with the presence of worm scale, with presence of candy, you do need some turns in order to be able to scale up your treasure pieces, right? Because your treasure pieces by themselves may not give a crazy amount of stats, especially if they are very low rarity, right? And lastly is also that a large part of treasure scaling comes from the fact that the treasure itself gives base stats, right? So that's how, going back to that earlier +1/+1 example, if you have a treasure that, let's say, um, doubles the value, like for example, Shield of Achilles doubles the stat value of bronze characters in your shop. Sure, on paper that may be good, but it may not scale as well because you don't have anything to scale off on in terms of the treasure values, right? Or something that is greedy treasures, right? For example, like a hidden treasure room, where if you get a common treasure, you also get an epic treasure. These also do not scale along with candy or with worm scale, which actually makes them a lot less consistent and don't actually fuel your board state if you don't already have the engines to be able to get these greedy treasures to pay off round after round, right? Okay, so that's the main sort of methodology or idea regarding why treasures are so strong and what are the values of treasures. So I'll be going over two custom deck snapshots. Granted, I don't have all the cards unlocked, but this should be enough to actually give you an idea of what sort of game state you're going for and what you're trying to achieve with certain cards, right? So I have two main custom decks. One is for general use purposes. So these are uh, cards. This is a custom deck that I would usually put in general use for those that are not really candy related. So this could be something like your collector or your electric, and as well as a candy shell. So this candy shell is more for decks that are leaning towards having candy as an archetype and does have a higher likelihood of having candy show up in your shops, right? So what I'm thinking of is maybe something like Sweet Tooth, Candy Pandy, or even Candyman, right? You can actually take a screenshot of it. Again, this is not the definitive custom deck layout. Feel free to swap out your custom decks with some of the alternatives that I may be sharing later, right? Custom decks actually become very important in higher ranks because you do want to have these. Again, going back to the dragons example, a lot in the general use are dragons because you want those dragons to show up in your pool at a higher likelihood so that you can get your treasure engines running, right? And so without those, you sort of put yourself at the mercy of RNG. Okay, so I'll be going into the cards from common up to legendary. So I think the first one to start the ball off is Aladdin. I think Aladdin is a very strong pick, especially in the early game, because of the current state of the game where the pool of common cards is very low. So in your first few turns, you really have a very high likelihood of hitting Aladdin. He also has very good tempo in the sense that he has a very decent base stat line. It's 2-1, whereas you have a lot of other cards that usually are 1-1 but have some carryover. And uh, in the likelihood that if you're able to get the silver of him in the first 1 to 3 turns, the treasure itself can actually give you a lot of good tempo. So for example, if you have a twin shot or fortifications, that's a +2 attack, a +2 health across the board, which really allows you to trade in and actually survive that early game, right? The cons is of course once after the early game. Usually I don't keep Aladdin after silvering him. But if he does again when he does show up in your uncommon or your rare pools, usually it's a skip because of how low his base stats are as compared to other characters. Next will be Beanie Baby. Beanie Baby has a strong stat line, and also the fact that he gives you a treasure is actually a very good early game trigger for cards that need treasures early on or stand to value from treasures early on. So in this case, for example, Collector or Trash Panda, right? So these cards, when they have their treasures, they get to benefit more from Treasure Hoard. Collector gives you +1/+1 across the board when your Beanie Baby dies, right? And of course, the 2/4 is quite a strong stat line in the early game to be able to let you trade. The downside of this is that Beanie Baby doesn't have any innate stats in its treasure, so it doesn't really scale with any of your late game scaling options. Next is Lance a Little. So they recently, 1-2 months back, have nerfed Lance a Little from 8 to 10 attack in order to achieve its quest, right? The good thing about Lance Little is that it's once you get it early, you have a very consistent and strong scaler because firstly it scales by slots, and the +1 attack means that it also scales with your stat scaling equipment or your stat scaling tools and treasures, right? Of course, the thing about Lance Little is that you may need some actual investment to be able to get him to that 10 power, right? So, in terms of getting either a thief spell, uh, or having a puck, or even in some cases just having a nesting scrap file to be able to get Lance Little to be able to hit that crash condition, which in sometimes maybe too slow. Sometimes when it comes to if I'm not able to get Lance Little online by turn 4 turn 5, usually it's a skip for me because his innate stats are really too low that getting the quest condition will lose you too much tempo to be able to stay in the game. On the alternative side, we have Miseria, which kind of has the opposite mm, problems that Lance Little has. Whereas Lance Little is a bit difficult to actually get your quest condition achieved. For Miseria, it's almost way too easy, right? But she also suffers from the same issue in that if you lose a fight early game, sometimes you may lose too much tempo to be able to recover, right? But on the contrary, because of how her treasure works, right? That +2/+2, after you lose a fight, you get a copy, right? You're able to actually recover quite a bit of tempo from that. In addition, right, if you're able to actually manage your hard loss well, right, this can even go up to getting 4 or 5 or 6 constellation prizes, depending on how you strategize your losing, right? Because let's say you lose your first round with Miseria, you get 1 prize. You lose again, it becomes 2 prizes, right? But the thing is that the third time you lose, it becomes 4 prizes because each of the individual prizes gives you a constellation prize. So that gives you an overall +8/+8 across the board, which is actually pretty decent, all things considered, right? And of course, going back to the example, because it's a stat treasure, that +8/+8, let's say you cantify it once, that becomes a +12/+12, right? Tinkerer, you Tinkerer as well. One Tinker trigger, even at the base level, is also able to give you that exponential scaling when all of the treasures get buffed together, right? So I think in terms of Miseria, if you're able to get a way to actually candify her, or if you could say early game, I'm not really able to get any good picks. Actually, Miseria is actually I used to actually underrate Miseria, but she's actually a lot stronger than you would think she is. Yeah, so Miseria is actually a lot stronger if you're able to recover from that tempo from the very first loss. Next one is Blackjack. So we're now moving on to the rares. The Blackjack is one of the earliest treasure engines that you sort of get to be able to allow you to get treasures turn after turn. Granted, it's only a maximum of 1 since it's the first time you survive. Uh, and it's also the fact that you're able to get a common treasure allows you to actually synergize with a lot of the greedy treasures, because a lot of the greedy treasures require you to have a common treasure before you can get an additional uncommon treasure, and like for flyer card. Again, going back to hidden treasure room, also getting an epic on top of that common treasure, right? So that's what is good about it. The downside of that is that it doesn't have a very strong stat line, so you do need to actually buff it up, right? Secondly, is that in it's sort of worse than some of the other treasure engines that you'll see later. And thirdly, is that you have no choice in terms of what treasure you want to get. So some of the common treasures can be really bad, right? but nonetheless, they are still treasures. They are still able to fuel Blackjack's treasure hoard condition. So I think for me, Blackjack is a very hit or miss card, right? If you get it early, sure, that's great. You can start to buff it up to actually get you your treasures. But later on in the game, its base stat line is too low to be able to get its condition to trigger consistently. On the other hand, you have Mechanical Dragon, which granted almost always triggers its condition, right? Because as long as it dies, it gives you that +1 Dragon Claw, right? But of course, if it dies, that means that you kind of don't really get the treasure hoard stat benefit from it at the get go, right? Because it has to die before you can actually get a benefit. So only on the next turn can you actually get the mechanical dragon value, right? But again, the treasure is pretty good in the sense that it's a stat scaler. Your characters have +1 attack. So having 3 or 4 dragon claws over the turn can have that good scaling. Going back to that initial treasure value, right? The downside of mechanical dragon is that it's a sort of it used to be a common treasure, dragon claw, which allows you to synergize with your greedy treasures when it comes to scaling up your treasure value. But now that it's been a rare treasure, you would find that there are very few uh, treasures in the game or cards in the game that will give you more for rare treasures, right? So I think the only treasure that would probably come to play is Dwarven card since it counts on the number of treasures, and maybe Jasmine Dragon because of that +1 free shop, right? So yeah, it's much more consistent, but it's also less it's not able to it's a bit less greedy when it comes to Blackjack. Maverick and Icewing. I think this is a pretty easy condition to clear if you're able to get your treasure engines up and running. So for example, let's say if I have a mechanical dragon in the pool, usually I pick Maverick up because I can get within 2 turns I can get that rare treasure. And of course, because I have that engine, the treasure hoard 2 also comes into play. So when I get that Maverick, it's actually pretty strong tempo wise, and it usually allows me to stabilize my board, right? But of course, if you don't have a treasure engine, you don't have any golds, this is usually a skip. Next is Mr. Fox. Mr. Fox is, I think, Mr. Fox is kind of usually you see down the lines when it comes to hunt cards that you get a meme where your opponent's hunt card is a lot stronger than yours, right? So I think this is the same as what Mr. Fox is. Granted, he has that sneak tag to him, so that means that when he attacks, he usually attacks the opponent's back line, which usually when it comes to support centric lineups is usually a lot weaker. So you would have that hunt trigger go off, right? But um, there are some downsides to him. So he got nerfed. So there's that you don't already have tag that's added. So in some cases, if you have the same treasure as your opponent, or if your opponent has no treasures, right? It's kind of your hunt trigger is not going to trigger, so it's kind of worse off, right? So I put here one of his core weaknesses, other than the fact that you need buffs for him, is that he is sort of Goldilocks sort of card, right? Because he himself is not dragon, so he doesn't have treasure hoard. So you need buffs for him. But the thing is that getting him too early will kind of break you because even if you hunt your opponent has no treasures or has relatively worthless treasures, right? You don't really get too much value out of his hunt, right? But when it comes to being later on in the game, because of his weak base stat line, you almost never really get his hunt working off because your opponents probably have quite decently statted epic cards in their pool. So your Mr. Fox isn't going to kill anything to trigger that hunt condition, right? So it's sort of you have to get him just right. to be able to get that value. But he's still a relatively good card because of the fact that you're able to steal your opponent's treasures, and if your opponent discovers treasures, usually those are pretty good value treasures. Okay, now I'll be going into some more cards, but I think you would start to see that some of the cards that I'm picking here are they're not really very good. They're really kind of bait on paper, and I think the first one that kicked things off is Netherbinder. I think when I first unlocked Netherbinder to my collection, it looked very attractive, right? Because you see four of your neighbors get KO'd, and you get this Dragon Jewel, and this Dragon Jewel has such a high upside, right? You are able to actually double your treasure hoard value, right? So that's essentially a double in the amount of stats you gain, and you're able to allow access to secret rare treasures based on that discovery condition, right? But in practice, what when I pick Netherbinder in my comps, a lot of the times it doesn't really work out, and the main reason is because of its quest condition, right? You need to see four of your neighbors get KO'd. So in order to maximize the chance of that happening, you will need Netherbinder to be in the middle position, right? In your lineup. So in the best case scenario, you have Netherbinder in the middle. You have 2 turns, right? Both turns your Netherbinder survives, and your first and third position cards sort of die, and then you get the treasure, right? But in practice, that doesn't always work out, right? So why that's the case is because usually your opponent maybe either kills the Netherbinder outright, right? You need the buffs to be able to have Netherbinder be able to survive for your side characters to die off, which is again not very consistent, right? If your Netherbinder dies, you don't get the quest triggers, right? Usually my first card is my slammer, so it has the highest stat line, right? So usually that doesn't die first, right? So that because of that, you really have a lot of cases where in practice you see that Netherbinder only has 0 cards that actually procs in that turn, or 1 card even at most that actually fulfills that quest condition. So a lot of the times I usually end up losing before I even get Netherbinder to go off, or I really start delving into the legendary pools, right? And that is way too late for you to be able to get Netherbinder's value going off. Yeah. So I think Netherbinder is really looks good on paper, but in practice it's a really big skip, right? I don't think with how its quest condition is lined up, it's very it's consistent enough at higher levels of play to be able to get off, right? Next is Rolo. Okay. So I think Rolo and Gwyn here, as you can see, are more on the archetype where you don't really rely on dragons to be able to get your treasures, right? So in this case, when it comes to Rolo, is that when you recruit a quest character, so in this case it means just a recruit, you don't have to achieve the quest condition to be able to get the treasure. So you get the random treasure of the quest character's rarity, right? I think one of the biggest downsides, or the main reason why I don't include the roller and green combination in my deck, is that in my custom deck, is that his base stat line is way too low. You lose so much tempo by having basically a -1 slot in your lineup, right? And again, if you want to recruit quest characters, usually quest characters are not strongly statted enough to be able to get enough value out of them, right? So you end up trading a lot of tempo on the chance to be able to get treasures, and these treasures may not be even valuable in the first place, right? And of course, lastly, is that if you don't have any quest characters show up in your pool, you effectively break yourself, right? and there aren't that many quest characters in the pool that you would have, right? Or that you would actually be able to trigger off, right? Of course, there is that payoff in the presence of Gwyn, in that Gwyn's one of the rare few legendary archetype characters that gives a very high base value for the quest continuation. But of course, the downside is that you need to complete the quest in order to be able to get it. So I think if you don't have any treasure engines that you have unlocked in your collection, I think Rolo is a decent option. But once you do have dragons, I think this you would want to skip these out completely for other dragon cards that have the base stats and the treasure engine potential in your pool. Right. Another card that is a bit debatable in terms of the value of Sunflare Glider. So again, it's also a treasure engine, similar to Mechanical Dragon, in that you get a Dragon Claw. But in this case, instead of being defeated, you get a Dragon Claw when you discover a treasure, right? And again, it's another card where when I look at it on paper, it's something that it looks very good. But when you actually start playing, you actually realize you don't really trigger this as consistently as Mechanical Dragon as well, right? Because it's upon discover, it's not upon getting a treasure, right? So this only works with 3 Blacks Full, the spell that lets you discover common, golding a card, and general reward quests. But when it comes to specific reward quests, right? For example, going back to Lance later, getting the lance, you don't get a Dragon Claw once you get the lance, right? Because it's a specific reward, right? You also don't get a Dragon Claw when you get a treasure from another greedy treasure, right? And of course, stealing a treasure, for example, Mr. Fox, or from Gloves of Thieving, you also don't get the Dragon Claw. So that's, in effect, it's a lot less consistent in practice than on paper, right? But it's still nonetheless a pretty decent option when you're not able to get any of your other dragons in the pool. Okay, the Butcher. The Butcher is a alternative win condition. I think when you should consider getting the Butcher is really if you start to delve into your rare pools early enough and you see the Butcher, but you have a very weak board state and you see the Butcher in your lineup. I think the Butcher is a good alternative to be able to get you a early victory, right? Or at least a very strong tempo board state in the mid to maybe legendary boards, right? But after that turn 10, turn 11, you would soon find Butcher itself to be not able to compete with some of the very strong stat cards, right? In addition, the quest condition is quite easy to fulfill, right? You would take about 2-3 turns to be able to get Butcher on the board, right? Assuming that you don't have any other rare characters already present. But of course, the base stat line plus 20 plus 20 plus 40 plus 40 may not be enough when it comes to, again, the later game. Yep. But so I guess Butcher is something that you can get to quickly knock out your opponents and actually get you that top 3 placing, right? But when it comes to first place placing, if the other teams go for more conventional lineups, you would find yourself being unable to compete because of how weak rare card effects are compared to their epic or legendary counterparts. Okay, getting a short break here. Okay, now we'll be moving on to the epics. The next card here is Ironcast Dragon. Sort of a Dragon X Mage interaction in that when you cast a spell on Ironcast Dragon, you actually get a random common treasure, right? Again, it's a pretty good treasure engine because if you cast two spells on him every turn, you do get two common treasures off the bat, right? And his stat line is pretty decent as well. The thing is that the condition to get it is also quite inconsistent in that you may not get him round after round, a treasure round after round, because you do need a spell shop that actually targets him, which I think it's about a 50-50 chance, maybe a bit less when it comes to spells in the spell pool. The second thing is that usually spells by themselves aren't really that good innately. So in a sense, you're actually trading a potential stronger card pick for a spell and a random common treasure, right? So that is again something that is may not be sufficient if you don't have the setup for it, especially when it comes to epic or legendary boards, where by themselves the legendaries already can outstat an Ironcast Dragon by themselves, right? So it's a very tricky sort of trade up that you would have to consider. Usually, if I don't have a treasure engine on the board, I'll keep Ironcast for maybe 2 to 3 turns and try to gun for a treasure and then pivot to a stronger legendary later on because his base stats are not enough to be able to see things through. Next is Jasmine Dragon. Now, Jasmine Dragon is something that, on the other hand, I think I would almost always pick up because of how good the effect is, right? Getting a bonus shop every turn, if you're able to get your treasure engine running, is +1 stat potential, +1 treasure, +1 spell treasure that you can actually get, or +1 ability to silver or gold the card that you can get, right? So that is actually a very good card to be able to keep on the board, and the condition is really quite easy to fulfill if you're already running a treasure engine setup, right? Again, going back to the cons, if you don't have the treasure generator, it's usually a skip. Sir Francis Drake. So this is sort of the epic version of Mr. Fox in some sense. You have Treasure Hoard 2, which is a good stat scaler, especially if you already have some treasures on the lineup. You don't have Sneak, so you sometimes may not be able to get it off, especially if you hit their first position, which is usually their strongest card. So that's the trade-off, but you're able to get a high rarity treasure consistently. After a few turns, you're able to you keep Francis Drake on the board, right? So that is also quite a good upside, right? Again, one of the down and going back to the downsides is that usually it falls off after you get your hunt completed. But by then, I think that's a good point for you to actually switch it up to trade in your Francis Drake for maybe a Bahamut when it comes to the stat line, right? So you get your legendary treasure, you're already about in end game, and you get something that is decently statted to be able to get you through or survive for your first place, second place, third place finish. Smug. I think Smug is also, to me, Smug is actually an auto include actually into a custom deck. I think it's something that he's also somewhat a card that is a bit underrated. The main reason why is that while legendary treasures are usually very strong, uh, they aren't really very consistent, right? So if let's say you don't run a hero or villains lineup, and your left legendary is Excalibur, you're not really able to actually get a lot of value out of it in the get go, right? But what I've come to realize as I played more of him is that he's actually a very good card to actually turn around your board state, right? So if you have a very weak board state, having that treasure hot tree allows you to have a decently statted minion. And when it comes to seeing, for example, your gold dawn, a gold common that shows up in your shop, it's not like, oh, I don't really need this common, right? I don't really need this treasure, right? Because you can get that dawn, and then your left legendary could be Tiamat's Claw, for example. And then you have a way back in the game where when your board state is pretty weak, right? So it's actually a very good incentive to actually go leftover commons, uncommons that you may not want the card itself in your lineup in the first place, but the treasure. But now because of Smug, you actually have a chance to actually have a good legendary treasure that can bring you back in the game, right? But of course the downside is it doesn't really scale by himself. And of course, a few legendaries are bad. But on the most part, you get something like a Statue of Olympus. You get something like Bunyan's Axe, for example. You get a legendary that can bring you back in the game, that can scale, and you find yourself in a much better position than you would otherwise be without the smug, right? And that's why I do put smug in my lineup. Next one, I think this is a short one, Thunder of Dragons. Uh, it's almost always an auto include because it's a tutor, right? Having a tutor in the board, even though he's a dragon, so his stat line is already pretty good, right? But being able to tutor out your Burninator, your Worm Scale, much quicker, I think that's why Thunder is a auto include, especially with how much other non-dragon cards there are in the deck, right? Of course, there's a risk you hit um, bad dragon cards at this stage of the game, like your commons like Dragon Link or your rare Blackjack, which don't do anything for you. But oftentimes, I usually win my games by getting a Thunder into a Burninator or Worm Scale that allow me to actually transition very easily into a treasure lineup in my legendary, in the legendary turns, right? Okay, next, Two-Headed Dragon. Mm, Now, I think one of the things that you sort of realize as you play the game is that you shouldn't bank all your eggs in golding a card, right? Even if the upside is very good, right? I think one of the other cards that I was thinking of trying out that actually wasn't really very good was Uta. I think his name is called Uta. Basically, it's the hero that gives you a secret rare if you gold it. But the thing is that his base stat line isn't good. You take way too long to be able to gold him to be able to get your secret rare, and sometimes you don't even gold him at all, right? Because of how many cards there are in the pool. So I think Two-Headed Dragon is the same thing as well. You have that potential to get that additional treasure, but if you don't have an alchemist tree stat, you don't have a way to actually be able to guarantee, or hand of Midas to be able to guarantee its gold, means that you may never actually get that gold condition to pop out. And otherwise, he is a decent base stat line for a dragon. But if you have other dragons, if you have a Jasmine Dragon, if you have a Thunder of Dragons in your pool, uh, those are much more consistent and bring much more consistent value to your board, right? As compared to a two-headed. I'll only choose a two-headed if I don't see any dragons in my pool. And yeah, I think that's about it. Bahamut. I think Bahamut is I think people put Bahamut as an instant pick, right? Especially if you have the treasures already there. But Bahamut coming kind of just he just is a stat stick at the end of the day. He has a very high treasure hot value, treasure hot 5, high base stats, right? Dragons. So Usually, if you have your treasure engine up and running, he's usually 130, 150 on both attack and health at the endgame state, which can help you trade out better, help you fight for board, right? But if you don't have treasures, you don't have any other value qualities for Bahamut, you might rather go for Nessie, which is a flat 50, 60 static card to actually be able to fight back, right? So yeah, I think he's just it's just a vanilla card uh that can trade well. Yeah, nothing much to say. Just keep it in. Okay. Flopsy then is a more exciting card for me. I think Flopsy is something that once you start playing her, you start to realize how crazy Flopsy can be, right? Uh, Again, it's a Fey card, so all of your Fey stat boosts will also bump up Flopsy. So usually, sometimes if even in the worst case, I would get about a 30 to 40 stated Flopsy. And so that means that your leftmost card has a plus 30 or plus 40 stats to it, which can be as you buff your Flopsy or you buff the slot that Flopsy in, can even go higher and higher, right? And that can actually give you enough stats to stay in the game, right? So I've had those pop off turns where I think one of the common combos for Flopsy is Flopsy plus Angelica. So let's say you Angelica, you get the hunt condition, whatever Angelica stats are buffed, okay, they go onto your Flopsy. Your Flopsy then gets your leftmost Angelica to have itself and the Flopsy stats. Or you, let's say in a case you're very lucky, you get a silver leftmost Flopsy, right? And then that essentially doubles your Flopsy stats. It doubles the stats of your leftmost card um, going forward in the future. And so you have, you know, cards that may seem kind of useless, like a Hungry Hyena going like 200, 200 because of the Flopsy condition, the Flopsy benefit bonus that comes in. And of course, the Treasure Hoard as well, right? The downside is you need the Flopsy to be strong to be able to have it scale up well. And in quite a number of cases, your leftmost card can essentially break, right? You can have a 130 rolls that is just a stat stick and isn't able to get you any value, right? Other than being strong stat wise. But otherwise, yeah, Flopsy is a really strong pick as an alternative win con. That I think people may underrate. Hephaestus, also another dragon. I think this is it's very much a win more card, right? You get an additional legendary off the bat if you have a common, uncommon, and rare, and he has quite a strong stat line. But otherwise, if you don't have him, he's just no better than he. I guess he's in some sense weaker than Bahamut because of the treasure hoard. So he doesn't really. And if you're already having a common, at least a common, uncommon, and rare treasure, you usually have enough snowball potential to be able to get some of the other legendaries to bring you back in the game, right? You're already in sort of a winning state already, right? So I think Hephaestus for me is looks good, but doesn't really have that much of a swing potential, right? Oh, and of course, it's not a consistent engine as well, right? So as compared to Oracle here, who if you get attacked, you get a treasure of the attacker's rarity. So in most cases, that's a +1 treasure, and it can even net you legendary treasures. Because usually, when you get Oracle, you're already facing legendary boards, right? Which means that's pretty good, right? You get a legendary treasure. If they have a secret rare and they attack your Oracle, you get a secret rare treasure, which is wow, that's pretty powerful, right? Uh, but course, the downside is you need some level of stat investment to be able to have your Oracle be able to survive more than one turn to get more than one treasure. And in most cases, even if you have a decently statted Oracle, you actually usually only get up to one treasure because usually what I encounter when I run my Oracle is that I'll put Oracle on position 3, right? Sure. But your Oracle usually takes an attack and then it attacks. And by the time it attacks the second time around, it's already dead, right? And in some cases, if your Oracle is the one that attacks first without being attacked, your Oracle just dies and doesn't give you any treasure. So it's a bit inconsistent that way. But still, nonetheless, I think it's a decent treasure pickup. Especially since you are looking for good treasure engines at the end of the day to fuel your lineup. Skeletor. Skeletor is again dragon archetype legendary that just gives you more stats. Gives you the legendary if you have plus 100, right? So I think it's a bit paradoxical, Skeletor, because if you already have a dragon engine lineup, you already have your treasures flowing in. You don't really need a Skeletor anymore, right? Sure, your Skeletor is already 110, 120 stat line, but your innate dragons and your innate treasures would already be having a board that reaches that threshold, right? So at the end of the day, you get a Skeletor with the same stat line as your dragons already on your board, with a plus 1 legendary, which is okay. It doesn't really cut it, and of course, I think that's a bit odd with Skeletor is that it doesn't have treasure hoard, so it also isn't able to scale up with the rest of the dragons in your board. So yeah, I've put Skeletor in a few games, but yeah, usually I don't keep him around long enough. I'll usually just get him for the treasure and then just like dip, right, and trade him out for a better legendary dragon that scales with treasure hoard. Burninator. This is an auto include, right? It has the highest base treasure hoard, so you would have it going for 150 plus, and its effect also sort of multiplies its stats, right? With that, keep all three treasures. Of course, the value of the treasure, it's a bit of a disparity, right? It's because having 3 common treasures can't really beat having 3 legendary treasures. But being able to keep all 3 legendary treasures or keep any 3 treasures is a really, really strong effect, right? And with that 3 treasures, even getting 1 discover off the board, it's 6 times 3, that's a plus 18, which is nothing to scoff at when it comes to getting treasures, of course, right? Of course, the condition is that by himself, he needs some level of treasure discovery to come into play. But once you have that, it's he's actually really, really good. Okay, I think we're going up to the end now. So some of these cards are really just wow, right? So of course, the main sort of card that everyone raves about in Reddit, in the forums, Worm Scale Tinkerer with the Pixie Dust. I don't have Pixie Dust effect here, but what it does is that it gives all your phase buffs +2/+2, right? So in the case of Worm Scale here, if you have a Pixie Dust, on the first time that you have it, it becomes improve your treasure buffs by +3/+3, right? So where this you can sort of see where this kind of starts to get really scary or really crazy in terms of the stat value that it gives, right? So first thing is that it boosts all your treasure buffs, right? So if you have, let's say, 4 Dragon Claws, right? That's +4/+4 to +1/+1 to each of your Dragon Claws. So that's overall +4/+4 treasure buff gain, right? And this is each fight, right? So that is crazy. Second thing is that if you have previously played Fey cards that boost amount health gain or attack gain for the rest of the game, it wouldn't be a treasure buff +1/+1, right? For example, you have a Peachy Queen. Peachy Queen gives your Fey buffs +1/+1. Worm Scale is a Fey, so your +1/+1 becomes a +2/+2. Then you have Pan Shadow, you have a Peter Pan, that becomes a +3/+3. So every turn, your treasure buffs exponentially increase by +3/+3, right? Where it gets even crazier is that if your +3/+3 affects your pixie dust, right? So your pixie dust becomes instead of a +2/+2 becomes a +5/+5, right? And then your +5/+5 affects your worm scale, right? So that your worm scale baseline by itself is +3/+3 is +3/+3 +5. So it's a +8/+8, right? And so you have this sort of Fibonacci, you have this sort of exponential increase every turn that worm scale tinker buffs the pixie dust, which actually buffs it back, right? Which is why people keep calling it to be nerfed, because it's an act with just these two cards, you actually get this exponential scaling on all of your treasures, which can lead to 1,000+ boards, 10,000 E-level boards. Yep. But of course, the downside is that you need a turn for a worm scale to trigger, right? So you do need, if you are already in a late game board where you're fighting for survival, your worm scale isn't really going to do much, because you need actually a few turns to actually get that scaling going, right? And of course, if you don't have any buffs for your worm scale, it's a base +1/+1, which, in all honesty, if you don't have the treasures, you don't have the phase to actually boost it up, it isn't really that powerful, right? You need several other things in the package for worm scale to be able to pay off. But when it does pay off, you find yourself being very difficult to lose. Okay, I think this is probably the last card in the overall dragon archetype. Tiamat. So Tiamat is the secret rare. So you would need maybe a TLK, some maybe a hunt transform like Karma Chameleon or Mysterious Egg to be able to access secret rare cards. But it is a decently strong ability, right? In terms of getting dragons, right? Because at this point you already should have a dragon board, right? It has the second highest base treasure hoard after Burninator, and if you're able to pop it, proc its condition off, you're basically getting a +5 treasures per turn, which if you have Burninator, just basically makes all your treasure hoard dragons a lot stronger, right? But of course, the downside is that if you don't have the dragon ball, you don't have treasures, it's kind of worthless, right? It doesn't really have any having only one treasure a turn, and it's not strong base deadline, doesn't allow you to beat other secret rares which have either upfront very strong capabilities or very rapid scaling potential. Okay, so that's mostly it for the base stats. So I think I'll just be going over quickly some of the strong honorable mentions, candies, and treasures to look out for. So in terms of the candy archetype, I have Frosting Dragon, Knight of the Holy Cane, and Gummy Worm. I think for the first two, I think they're pretty decent in terms of being able to get your candy online, which is something that you need when you want to candyfy your treasures, right? Because if you only have a +1 candy trigger, candyfying your treasure is only going to give it +1/+1, which isn't really much, all things considered. So having these cards being able to be there to boost up your candy value is pretty decent on itself. The one thing that I want to highlight is Gummy Worm. I think Gummy Worm is really an auto include, very much because of the candy benefit, right? So in the case that you're not able to get Worm Scale, you could consider getting Gummy Worm as another exponential scaler, right? Because in every time you increase your candy counter, all of your stat-based candy fight treasure actually get +1/+1, based on that single candy trigger. So that is actually quite strong. Gives you a very strong set of treasures to be able to improve your board state consistently. And of course, it means that all future candy treasures that you find are candified. So everything, any future candy treasure, for example, your consolation prize, can be candified and also give you that buff. Okay, another few other honorable mentions. Fairy Dragon, decently statted Dragon Fey that has treasure hoard. Good way to fight in the mid game if you don't have any dragons available. Tin Man, if you're behind, having that one hard trigger condition is pretty good, all things considered. You have Pirate Prince, decent stat line, and also guarantees you a treasure, right? And Coded, of course. You would have a decently statted board with the treasures that you have, so being able to have a +1 legendary within the 1 or 2 turns that Conan procs itself also is quite consistent as well. Right. A few honorable mention treasures that you should be looking out for or prioritizing, in my personal opinion, to be able to get. So in the early game, having the breadcrumbs allows you to effectively reroll. I think it's the S plus tier common treasure to get, because being able to see more options in your pools, get that higher likelihood to get the dragons that you need is almost essential, right? And you have fortification, twin shot. These early game stat boosts can actually allow you to survive the early game with the tempo loss that you may get from picking something like Aladdin, picking a quest character, or even picking carryover options like your Thorn or Rose. Having fortifications and twin shot lets you stay in the game and not have full hard losses in the first few turns. Dragon Dice is, I think, really arguably one of the strongest rare treasures that you can get. Being able to guarantee yourself a common treasure when you recruit a dragon is very powerful to get your treasure hoard up and running. Energizer, this thing is also something that can scale with worm scale and actually give an overall buff to everything that you have, right? Trash can full of strawberries. I used to think that trash can full of strawberries was pretty bad until you start to get treasure engines on the board. Until when you start to candify it, you realize how many additional stats it actually gives to all of your treasures, because of the fact that you are able to consistently get common treasures every turn, right? So I think that's a very strong treasure to also look out for if you have the means to actually able to get it up and running. When it comes to the rares, the legendaries, the super rares, I think one thing on the back of my mind is really how am I able to exponentially improve my treasure engine gain, right? If I'm able to keep getting treasures turn after turn, that would actually let me stay in the game because of the treasures effect and because of the treasure hoard scaling that my dragons would get, right? So Girls of Thieving, stealing a treasure from your opponent, Tiamat's Claw, being able to guarantee being sort of a pseudo Tiamat, in the sense getting enough triggers will get you that treasure, and Trifork being a sort of alternative to Burninator. These allow you to get treasures and allow you to sort of stay ahead in the game, right? And so lastly, I will be going over some general strategy that I will be trying to think of when I actually play dragons, right? So early game would be trying to survive, getting that early treasure from Aladdin to get decent statted board tempo so that you don't lose any full hearts early on. Looking out for phase scalers like Peter Pan, Pan Shadow, so you can carry over to your worm scale when you do get it. In the mid game, then it's trying to find those rare dragon engines that I shared about earlier, and of course to actually buff your treasure cards, treasure hunts, so that you're able to get any value. And then lastly is in the end game, on the late game, you want to actually start getting you want to get that full 5 dragon lineup so that you can actually scale off your treasure engines and get those bonus shops, those rarer treasures to actually fuel your scaling, and then look out for worm scale, burninator, etc. If you're not able to get any dragons, then usually I would actually go for whatever is the highest stated, for example, a Nessie, to be able to actually survive for the rest of the game. And then lastly is to also try to pivot to look for secret rares. I think secret rares pivots are a bit hard to judge, right? I think a clear indicator where you need to start getting secret rares is that if you start fighting um, bots that one shot you, or you see an opponent's secret rare on the board, right? But I think the biggest challenge for secret rares is that they can be very hit or miss, right? If you do get your Paul Bunyan from your True Love's Kiss, then at least it's able to match up and fight back and get you back a lot of tempo that you need to be able to stay in the game. But if you get something like a Triple Trouble or an Echoing Fairy or Dravena in a game state where you're already trying to fight for first and second place, that it's just not enough to get you there, right? It's too late in the game to get you there, right? Yeah. So I think that's about it for my overall meta snapshot. If you liked the video, do consider giving it a like and subscribe. And also do comment down below if you want to see more archetype videos, where maybe I can go over different archetypes. Maybe I can go over some of the, maybe do a tiering of the secret rares, etc. Or maybe even live gameplay demonstrations. Do let me know. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one.